Good afternoon to our CLA family, friends, colleagues, and community partners. Welcome back to our live stream. We have a jam-packed show today, as usual, so let's quickly get the housekeeping out of the way first. Please continue to send us your questions and comments to our inbox at livestream@claconnect.com, and we'll answer what we can during the session, as well as follow up as we are able. After the session, if you're interested in more specific consultation, please contact us using the Contact Us button on the COVID resource page at claconnect.com, and we'll connect you with the appropriate advisor. Our guests today are talking with us about the very important issues around cybersecurity. One, because it's Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and also because we're seeing increasing attacks lately with more of our nation's workforce remotely working from home. We're also talking about some important updates to the PPP program as it relates to the latest presidential announcements and the guidance last night. So here with me are Javier Young, who is on our cybersecurity team, as well as Matthew Rambrin and Jack Rybicki. Welcome to the show, everyone. As always, we have so much to cover that we best dive in quickly with Javier. It feels like I'm always hearing about cyber attacks lately, Javier. So I was wondering if you could talk to us about what are some ways organizations and we as individuals can better protect ourselves.
Certainly. So often what we do is we practice good security practice at work, and then once we get home, it's just not as important to us. However, I'm here to tell you that good cybersecurity safety and practice really should start at home and be embedded into everything we do, both online as well as at home. So some of the things that we can do to really protect ourselves visually as well as an organization is really limit our web footprint as much as possible online. This is very easy to do when we're talking about the individual level. What I'm talking about is social media footprint. So don't broadcast necessary information on the public web as an individual, birth dates, addresses, even travel plans to some extent. And these things may be a little harder for most organizations to do simply because we want to keep up branding. But as much as organizations can, I would suggest limiting information, especially about executives, as far as email addresses, phone numbers, physical locations of certain individuals. What we find here at CLA is that many malicious attackers like to perform reconnaissance on the web in an effort to gain as much information about an organization or an individual to better inform their attack vectors. So, please limit your web footprint as much as possible so you won't be attractive to a malicious attacker. Another thing that I would suggest is many of us have fallen habit into using the same password across multiple sites and platforms. If you could, please use a unique password and a complex password for these sites, as if you are compromised on one site or area or an account, the likelihood that an attacker is going to try those same credentials for another account that you may have is highly likely. And like I mentioned, many people share passwords, and it's just opening the door for these attackers to run rampant. At the house, what we can do, especially when it comes to wireless networks, remove default passwords for the devices that are sent. When we sign up for internet through our internet service providers, oftentimes they'll come out with, they stick a little sticker on the side of the modem router that has your broadcast, your Wi-Fi name, as well as the password for that. And the default authentication method is actually WEP in some instances. So ensure that you change that to WPA2 to protect your wireless networks, and that you remove all default devices everywhere. Another thing about wireless networks at home, why it's very important, you want to protect yourself from war driving. So leaving your wireless network unsecure is not suggested, but there are websites that are dedicated for people that literally go around and drive in their vehicles trying to capture SSIDs for wireless signals that are unauthenticated. They post this to a site. There's one called wiggle.net where you can just go in as a regular user, type in an address, and it will pull up all the broadcasting wireless networks in that area. And then segment those networks where possible. So I know me, I have a guest network for visitors or weekend visitors that, I allow them to have access to this area over here and don't let them communicate to my other wireless networks that may have my smart devices or my home office devices. So just be smart about using your smart devices as well as home assistants.
That's really interesting. I never really thought about that. My kids, every time their friends come over, everybody logs into our Wi-Fi, and I never even think about it, but you make a really good point. The other thing you mentioned too are your smart devices and assistants. I was wondering if you could go into that more for me, please.
Sure, absolutely. Really, a lot of us have smart TVs, smart streaming devices, home assistants, be it Alexa, Google Homes. I think Facebook has a home device now, and we all on our phones have the ability to communicate with Siri or Google Assistant. What many people may not realize is that these devices are constantly listening. And what I mean by that is that they're always waiting for a trigger word. So where you actually trigger a response from that device by, yelling out Siri or I think it's OK Google in some instances, that, these devices may start recording. And by default, they actually record snippets of the audio that you will say after a trigger word. So just think of times, you may have been watching television and a television commercial for one of these devices comes off. I know it certainly triggered my devices to go into, listening mode or recording mode. So by default, like I said, they do record certain audio. So think about things that you may not want picked up on audio, which kind of goes back to ensuring that all of your accounts are locked down. Would you really want your device to record, private conversations that may be sensitive in your home, that an attacker may get into that account and have the ability to search for those audio recordings? So, you know, ensure that these devices are listening only when you want them to listen and go from there. Another thing that we should consider here are devices like security cameras specifically. These are also smart devices at home that you can access away from the home via any type of internet connection. There have been instances where both Wise and Ring cameras have been compromised by attackers, and what they've been able to do is come in and view video of those devices, and in many instances interact with the microphone to communicate with those devices. I know a lot of us have those set up in our home nurseries for our newborns or our children, or at our doorbell. So we definitely want to keep those things safe. And it's also very interesting. I read an article this morning where security researchers were actually able to compromise Comcast voice remotes. So these are remotes that you can communicate through the remote. It interacts with the set-top box, excuse me, and you can change the channel, lower volume, or what have you. And what they discovered is by sitting outside of a home address up to 65 feet, they were able to gain access to that communication between the set-top box and the voice remote, gain access to the microphone, and eavesdrop on private conversations within a home. So definitely just want to make sure that our smart devices are locked down as much as possible.
I think that's really helpful. Another question that's coming in that's interesting and ties into something you mentioned earlier when you were talking about phishing and limiting our web footprint. I was wondering if you could just go into a little bit more detail about limiting that web footprint.
Sure. So phishing is just a huge deal. It always has been. Statistics show that roughly 90-ish% of all cyber attacks begin with some form of phishing, mostly email phishing campaigns. So malicious hackers, what they generally do, as I mentioned before, they do a good bit of recon to build a better mousetrap, so to speak, or in this case, bait for fish. So the less that they can find out about you online, the harder it's going to be to potentially target you or compromise you both at the individual and organization level. Another thing that malicious attackers try to do to appear more authentic is they leverage current events in an attempt to attract users to interact with emails that they do intend to send. So we at CLA on the cybersecurity team, we perform email phishing as a standalone service, but generally we perform it along with our external penetration test. And what we have noticed this year is just by referencing coronavirus or COVID-19 in a phishing email, The confidence level that we will get somebody to interact with our phishing email just raises so much higher, because people really want to know about what's going on in current events. So we've been wildly successful in getting users to interact with our phishing campaigns. So excuse me, with the impending election coming up, as well as the holiday season, just be very mindful that these are what attackers are going to use. Last night we had a vice presidential debate. So things or topics that come up from that debate, people may try to send you via email to get you to click on a link. Oh, look what this candidate said. Look what this candidate said. That urgency, that shocking news that they think that you're going to interact with. So
Yep.
CLS wants you to remind you to before you click the link.
Absolutely. And I think you raised something that's really interesting too, as far as like what can we do at home? You guys have been so successful in testing us, I guess, and getting those just the employee base to click on things, especially like if it's coming from our phone, we don't see it quite as well or whatever. But are there ways that we at home can just identify if an email is indeed a phishing email so that we can be a little bit better about this?
Sure. So a few things that you want to do is think about just someone popping up unannounced as you're at your home. You should view email messages as the same way. If you receive any unsolicited email message, that should just kind of raise suspicion in itself. And then, once you receive that message, there are a few things that I like to recommend that you look for. One of those things is the greeting generic? Does it specifically mention your name, or is it a coverall like "Hey all" or "All
Hmm.
or all employees"? Are there attachments with this email? Or do the attachments seem legitimate, or are they nefarious? Do they have random names? Are there misspellings in the email? And more important, is there a sense of urgency from the email? So, meaning, is there anything that says immediate action required? Must do this within a time bound, or a time limit, excuse me. All of these are generally indicators of potential phishing emails. A lot of malicious attackers also, what they like to do is they like to spoof internal individuals and entities to organizations. So your internal IT departments, HR departments, accounting or what have you, or high-ranking individuals, so they can elicit, an immediate reaction or response. So what I would like to do is just say, if the email seems uncharacteristic of the individual that it appears to be coming from or the entity, certainly, take precaution and open that. Interact with your IT department before moving forward on through a safe means of communication, and also look at the sender email address, or hover over the link if you must, but do not click the link, just to
Hmm.
ensure that the website appears to be legitimate. Again, in our services to our clients for external phishing emails, we usually try to get doppelganger domains that look very similar to a client's actual domain. And most people don't realize that there's an extra letter in a domain, and we're pretty successful in that. So again, those are some points to help mitigate the risks of email phishing.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense to slow down and just be a little bit more careful, maybe now more than ever, on that. So, Javier, thank you so much. This is great information. And I know we learned a lot from you on this important topic. We also have questions that I've already seen coming into the inbox for you. So, if we have time, we'll get to that later. If we don't, and people are interested in learning more, um, those of you in the audience can register for our cybersecurity web series, and the link is down below me. So I'd like to make that available. At this point, I want to pivot back to our weekly discussion on PPP with Matthew and Jack. So welcome back, Matthew and Jack. Today, I'm going to start with you, Matthew, and ask for some updates from this week.
Absolutely. There are a few new updates worth mentioning. Last night, the SBA released some new facts, fact 52, actually one fact, I should say. In general, if a loan was made pre the Flexibility Act, which was signed into law on June 5th, the deferral period would have extended through 6 months, at which time interest and principal would be due. Now, the Flexibility Act extended that deferral period to 10 months, meaning you have 10 months from the time of completing your covered period to apply for forgiveness. at which point, if you don't apply within that 10 months, the interest and principal now becomes due. Fact 52 clears up this issue. And in summary, it states that lenders do not have to modify or amend the PPP notes and instead only need to notify the borrowers of the change to the deferral period from 6 to 10 months. So this is going to be an automatic change. Don't expect your lender to send you a new agreement. They're going to make the change automatic. Another update that came through was through an article that was published in the New York Post on September 30th last week, and it was titled "Feds Will Reportedly Start Forgiving Coronavirus Loans by Next Week," meaning this week as we speak. Now, we believe you should be a little cautious as this is not official guidance and was confirmed through a spokesperson for the Treasury, and it was sent via email to the New York Post. Some background on this is that the SBA has begun accepting forgiveness applications, or they've started accepting the forgiveness applications on August 10th, and has received over 96,000 forgiveness applications with none approved to our knowledge. The SBA's review process, as discussed in last week's live stream, is expected to take 90 days. So if this article is factual, then most forgiveness applications submitted on August 10th would be coming due, meaning the SBA is going to be within the 60 to 90-day window. So we would expect movement with those applications, and hopefully the forgiveness should come to fruition. To further provide some insight, banks are now receiving communications from the SBA stating that the SBA has begun remitting PPP loan forgiveness payments to lenders. So tying these two communications together, you should expect to begin seeing movement with the SBA's forgiveness process.
I think that's really helpful. Thank you for that update. There's another update that's coming just from some impactful tweets by the president. Can you talk about what those are and what those all mean for businesses applying for forgiveness?
Absolutely. The third update is related to obviously President Trump's tweet on ending stimulus bill talks until after the election. Now, he has backtracked a bit, suggesting that he would sign stimulus checks for individuals if it was presented in a standalone bill. So our general thoughts are there may be some additional stimulus or potential guidance that's not going to come until after the election. And if the election is expected to be contested, you could expect these, potential guidance or bills to come through, 30 days after that. So we're looking at beginning of December. So borrowers in the meantime, who are waiting for that automatic forgiveness of 150,000, they should start to consider and weigh the options of making a decision now to apply or wait for that guidance that might be forthcoming. Once again, both sides do have significantly differing policies and ideologies, so a borrower should weigh the chance of either party winning or their policies and potential impacts of those policies to their business.
Awesome. Thank you so much for those updates, Matthew. Jack, I'm going to turn to you because last Friday we finally got the guidance on the M&A transactions that the SBA Chief of Staff said was imminent at that House Committee on Small Business meeting on September 24th that we watched. The SBA released a procedural notice on the Paycheck Protection Program loans and changes of ownership. Can you give us some insight on what that notice covers?
Yeah, it was great to finally get some indication from them on the borrower's responsibilities in the event of a change in ownership, and then also when it applies and when you have to get approval from the SBA. And if you do request approval from the SBA, how that process should work, because the SBA has not been exactly easy to contact recently to get information from.
Yeah, absolutely. And given the number of questions we've been getting from our listeners, this has got to be quite a relief for companies that are contemplating a sale or a merger. Let's start at the beginning here. What falls in the scope of this guidance?
Yeah, so the guidance did lay out pretty clearly what's considered a change of ownership, and so this is going to be very helpful. So if you're doing a stock sale or a member interest sale, the threshold is 20%. So if you're selling 20% or more, it's considered a change of ownership. Now, the one thing they did point out is that doesn't need to be a single transaction. So if you have a series of transactions and in the aggregate, the total ownership sold is more than 20%, you would be deemed to have that change of ownership from a stock perspective. On the asset sale side of things, so if you're only selling assets, not the entity, it's a 50% threshold. So if you sell 50% or more of the assets measured by the fair value of those assets at the date of sale, then you would be deemed to have a change of control. And lastly, if your entity just merged with another entity, obviously that would also be deemed to be a change of control transaction.
Yeah, I think knowing those transaction thresholds is really great news for borrowers because it just allows them to conduct their business with some more certainty. Um, so now, as we continue to unpack this, if a borrower meets one of those conditions and is going to have a change of ownership, what do they have to do, Jack?
Yeah. So before we get into what they have to do if they have a change of ownership, I do want to stress something to potential sellers or folks that are borrowers that might be looking to dispose of their business or their assets. You're going to be on the hook for a bunch of stuff related to the PPP loan, whether you still kind of own the entity and the assets or not. And so I do want to make sure everybody understands that. So all of the representations you made at the onset of the loan and really all of the obligations under the loan, the SBA is not letting you out of those, even if you sell the business or sell the assets. And so you're on the hook for all of the obligations under the PPP loan, all the certifications that you made originating the loan. And if you have done a loan forgiveness application, those certifications as well and any other PPP related requirements, like how you spent the money during your covered period, all of those obligations really still fall to you, even in the event of a change in control. And additionally, if there are documents that you have to provide at some point down the road related to proof that you use the funds appropriately and that type of thing, you're still on the hook to do that again, even if you sell your business. And so it's very important that you maintain all that documentation. And in your agreement with the buyer, you put appropriate provisions that they will support you if you have inquiries there. So, in terms of things that you have to do, though, so prior to the closing of any change of ownership transaction, it is pretty simple. All you really need to do is notify your lender in writing of a contemplated transaction, and then provide your lender with a copy of the proposed agreements and then any other documents that they would need to kind of carry out the proposed transaction.
Okay, so does the SBA then need to approve the transaction if the borrower is only required to notify the lender?
Yeah, so they do in certain circumstances, and that was another great bit of guidance that we got here. So we learned that the SBA does not need to approve every transaction, right? And there were concerns about that for sure. And so, for instance, if the loan was fully satisfied prior to the closing, there's obviously no involvement by either the lender or the SBA at that point in time. That one's pretty simple. And, loan satisfaction can occur either by just paying back the loan or having gone through the PPP forgiveness process at that point already, right? So that's one way to get out of having to involve the SBA. But in the event that the loan is still outstanding, there are ways to not have to have SBA approval, and we're going to take those in two separate chunks. One if you're doing an asset sale, and one if you're doing a stock sale. So if you're doing a stock sale, there's actually a couple different ways to not have to have the SBA approval. The first one is if you're selling less than 50% of your company. And if you think about it, that makes sense because the originator of the loan is still in control of the company. And therefore, while there's a change in ownership, there's not a change in control, and that original group is still on the hook, after that. So if that's the case, the SBA does not need to approve that transaction. Now, the other type of transaction when the SBA would not need to approve it is, let's say you're more than 50% sale of equity, and this also applies to the sale of assets. So if you're selling more than 50% of your assets by fair value or more than 50% of the equity, as long as you have one, submitted your forgiveness application and all the related documentation to your lender at the time you're going to do the transaction, and you've used an escrow account that is controlled by the lender. So you're basically holding back some of those proceeds in an amount equal to the balance of the PPP loan. then because there's that security interest out there for the bank and the SBA, you don't need to go and get SBA a specific approval. Now, don't forget, you've already notified the lender of this, so they're aware of the transaction. They can assist in setting up the escrow accounts for you. But if you do those two things, so set the escrow accounts up and file your PPP forgiveness application prior to the transaction date, then SBA approval is not required. But if you don't meet those criteria, so if you're selling more than 50% and you haven't set up the escrow, then you do have to get the SBA approval for your transaction. Otherwise, the thought is that you'll be in default and the SBA will not grant forgiveness approval of the loan, and you'll have to repay that back.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it's really some very helpful information for borrowers on when the SBA needs to be involved in the transaction and how to structure to minimize the approval requirements. If the SBA does need to approve Jack, how does that process work?
So that really is going to be driven by the lender, right? So the again, that's why it's so important to have the lender involved. And so you're going to have to contact the lender. You're going to have to go through, are you going to meet those conditions? And if you don't, then the lender is going to need to submit a request to the SBA on your behalf. And the notice goes through the details of what you have to have in there. But the one thing that's the most important is you have to have a reason why you cannot satisfy those kind of safe harbors that we just talked about, and in particular, why it's not feasible to have the funds placed into an escrow account, right? And so there has to be a reason for that. Absent that, it may you may not get approved by the SBA. There are a number of other documents that are required to go along with that, but the lender will be able to help you through that in that process.
Awesome. Are there any other items of interest in that notice that our listeners or audience should know about before we exit this topic?
Yeah, the only other thing I would say is that it's interesting that what's happened is that the SBA is going to require that both the buyer of the business or the assets and the seller of the business and the assets effectively both take responsibility for the PPP loan. So if you have a merger transaction or a sale transaction, the SBA effectively now has two parties on the hook, both the buyer and the seller in each case, right? So it is important when you're drafting your purchase agreements to make sure you've got appropriate indemnifications for bad acts on the other party's behalf, and that there's also appropriate wording in there about collaboration and the willingness to work together to satisfy any inquiries that come from the lender or the SBA, as the forgiveness process proceeds. So, again, we would encourage involvement of the banks early, involvement of good legal counsel that's worked in this area before to make sure that you don't run afoul of these rules.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that update, Jack. When you were discussing the conditions that need to be present for the SBA not to have to approve a change of ownership, you mentioned that the borrower has to have submitted a PPP loan forgiveness application and all the required supporting documentation. So I'd like to pivot back to Matthew to unpack the documentation requirements a bit for our listeners, as we've been getting a number of questions on this topic. So Matthew, would you like to start with us in that kind of lens?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. The documentation requirements are just another area that's complex, but in general, if you follow the rules and the guidelines, which are found on the last page of the 3508 and the 3508 Easy Forgiveness Application instructions, you should be in good shape. I would say before you start going through the documentation requirements, consult with your lender and review their requirements because their documentation requirements may extend over and beyond the SBA's. Now, most companies, if you're using 24 weeks, you're most likely strictly using payroll. So we're going to focus mainly on the payroll side. Payroll documentation is going to need to support and verify the eligible cash compensation and also that non-cash benefit payment. So those are the health benefits, the dental, the vision, the retirement components. That information is going to need to come in the form of a bank account statement or a third-party payroll service provider documenting the amount of the cash compensation paid to each employee. The bar will also need to provide tax forms, or they say equivalent third-party payroll service provider reports, for the periods that overlap with the covered period and the alternative covered period. So we're talking about 941s, any state unemployment and disability filings that tie out to the relevant state and local taxes. The bar will also need to share payment receipts and cancel checks or account statements showing documentation for the amount of any employee contributions to the health insurance and retirement plans that the bar included in the forgiveness amount. So as mentioned before, you're going to have to do a general ticking and tying to make sure that, if you're going to use a third-party payroll register, you're going to want to tie that to your bank statement and then also tie that to the 941 or the state and local tax filing. Now, just to kind of quickly touch on the FT and the non-payroll, I'm just going to kind of burn through this real quick. On the FTE side, you want to make sure that you have enough calculations and documentation supporting your FTE calculations, meaning your full-time equivalent headcount. If you had reductions, if you retained your employees, what do they look like? How did you make those determinations? Have that information in an Excel format or some type of documentation format. So this way, if asked by the SBA, you can share it with them. On the non-payroll eligible costs, such as mortgage interest, rents, you're going to want to have the original agreements, those lease agreements, the mortgage interest amortization schedules showing the interest, and also canceled checks to support that the payment was physically made. If you're using utilities, same thing. You're going to want to have a copy of the utility bill and a canceled check. All of these documentation requirements are going to need to be kept for 6 years, and they can be pulled by the SBA at any point in time if they decide to review them.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Matthew and Jack. I know we're getting close on time here, but there have been a couple of clarifying questions that have come in actually for Javier. And a lot of those we'll address in the cybersecurity awareness session, so I don't want to spend too much of everybody's time, but there's one I think that's causing some anxiety. Javier, you mentioned, if you get those emails, don't click on the link. Could you just clarify for us quickly is the danger, or are you in danger if you opened the email, if you don't click on that link?
So generally, you are not in danger of just opening the email. What we generally see, if there's a link or an attachment, that is where the what we consider critical and high risk areas will come from. For the most part, I know a lot of organizations have implemented phishing and reporting buttons within their Outlook client, so that if you do get the email, you can automatically click that link and that gets forwarded to another team to either evaluate or block that sender of that email. So yes.
Okay, I think that helps kind of put people's mind at ease. So unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. For the other questions coming into the inbox, I want to call attention to an article that Jack wrote recently. It's on our COVID resource page. It's also out on LinkedIn. You can look at my profile, his, and a number of your consulting friends here at CLA for that information. And again, for those questions on the cybersecurity awareness, please do check out the link in the dialog box below me and go ahead and register for that series, because we will go much deeper into all of these challenges and questions. Next week, we'll be back with Leslie and some other updates. So please join us on Thursday at 2 Central once again. And in the meantime, stay tuned to what we have coming out through the website, through our COVID resource page, and just by contacting your advisor for some more specific consultation. Until then, thank you so much for watching. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to our moderators in the chat. And thank you to the audience for your engaged participation today. It's always a pleasure to serve you. We'll talk to you next week.
Bye.